6 small ships become the most effective force of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. The German submarine service will never break the code. They get found anyway. The Atlantic, summer of 1943. A point between the Azores and the Spanish coast. A radio operator aboard a German submarine picks up a slip with a set of coordinates and sends a short message into the open air. The transmission takes a few seconds, a routine, ordinary motion of a hand on a key. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz had personally vouched for the safety of those reports. The cipher machines were checked and rechecked, and every time the officers pronounced them impossible for the enemy to break, he recalled after the war. The submarine command staff built its entire management of the sea war on that confidence. Report the weather, the coordinates, any contact with a convoy. The same order for every boat. Without a report, the pack is blind. The count was wrong, but not about the cipher. The cipher really did hold. Sit with that sentence, because later in this story, it explains everything. At this exact minute, hundreds of miles from the boat, antennas turn on the decks of British sloops. Not to read the message, to find where it came from. This boat will go on the air again and again through the patrol, certain that the ocean stays silent in return. It will not learn that the silence ended until its very last day. The Atlantic in the winter of '43 is not a postcard with waves. It is 6 weeks with no land in sight, freezing water sweeping across the deck, a watch on which a man falls asleep standing up, lashed to his post by a storm line. In weather like that, hunting a submarine by hydrophone becomes an exercise in torture because the storm drowns out any engine noise underwater. It is exactly in weather like that the German command feels most confident, assuming no hunter in his right mind will put to sea in it. The stakes in this fight are not abstract. Britain brings in almost everything by sea: fuel for aircraft, grain for bread, steel for the factories. Every merchantman sunk is not just a hull on the seabed. It is weeks of production that will never reach a port. Stop the convoys, and the island starves without a single German soldier setting foot on English ground. That is exactly why both sides commit more to this stretch of cold ocean than to any land front of the same year. The Wolfpack tactic runs on communication. One boat finds a convoy in an empty ocean where there is nothing to the horizon but water, and reports the coordinates so the others can close in on the strike point within hours instead of weeks of blind searching. Without a report, the pack is blind and useless, scattered across the ocean one boat at a time, each on its own, with no shared target. Dönitz builds his entire campaign on that principle. Dozens of boats, scattered across thousands of miles, become a single force only through a radio wave. Giving up communication would have meant giving up the pack tactic itself and going back to lone hunting, the very approach that had already lost in the first stage of the war. So the command accepts the risk of transmitting on purpose, resting on a single assumption. If the cipher cannot be read, the position stays secret. That assumption never tests the transmission itself, only its content. And the content, as it turns out, was not what the enemy was after. By April of '43, some German commanders are already returning from patrol with the same complaint. An attack too often follows a transmission by only a short interval, as if the aircraft or the ship already knew where to go. Dönitz's staff record these reports, but explain them another way. Aerial reconnaissance, a chance crossing of routes, the ordinary bad luck of one particular boat. The idea that the habit of transmitting itself is to blame sounds too absurd to take seriously. On the other side of the ocean, at Western Approaches Command, another system is taking shape by 1943. A short captain with prematurely gray temples, who had spent much of his career between the wars on anti-submarine courses, is given command of a group of Black Swan-class sloops. His name is Frederick Walker, and he had never willingly stayed ashore, preferring the sea to paperwork. His superiors had considered him too stubborn for a fast career. The war finally gives that stubbornness a use. Walker does not want to simply escort convoys and beat off the occasional attack. He insists the group should be pulled off direct escort duty and sent out to hunt, pursuing a spotted boat for hours if necessary, instead of returning to formation after the first failed attack. His superiors find the idea risky. While the hunters chase one boat, the convoy is left partly uncovered. Walker gets his permission to experiment because there is almost nothing left to lose. The crews of the sloops quickly realize they have not landed under an ordinary commanding officer. Walker stays on the bridge for days at a stretch, reads the echo sounder reports himself, argues with the signalmen over seconds of delay in passing coordinates. The men call him simply Captain among themselves, without a rank, in the tone people use for someone they trust more than the manual. That trust will pay off later, when decisions need to be made faster than an order can arrive from a staff ship. He had one specific technical problem. The sonar searches ahead along the course, while the depth charges are dropped from the stern. In the final seconds of the approach, when the range to the boat becomes shortest, contact is inevitably lost, because the ship is passing directly over the target, and the boat has just enough time to turn away while the charges are still falling blind. German commanders know about this blind spot and count on exactly that moment during an attack, turning away in the precise few seconds when the hunter can hear nothing. Walker finds his answer in a new order of action. One ship holds contact by sonar and stays back at a safe distance. A second moves in slowly, without a ping, directly over the target, giving nothing away, and drops charges on a signal from the first, blind, but on exact coordinates passed from the stern. The boat below never hears it coming, because the approaching ship stays silent from start to the moment it fires. Walker calls it the creeping attack. Separate from Walker, another system is gathering strength across a network of British shore and shipboard stations, one that bypasses the cipher entirely. It does not need to read a German boat's message. It only needs the fact that a transmission happened. Two antennas, set apart from each other, take a bearing on the source of the signal, and wherever the two bearings cross on the chart, there is the boat. The system gets a short name from the sound of its call sign in headphones, Huff-Duff. By this point, receivers like it stand not only on land, but right on the decks of the escorts, next to the sonar gear. An operator at a station like this does not need to speak German and does not need to decode anything. It is enough to hear the signal itself and turn the loop antenna until the sound in the headphones is loudest. One bearing gives only a direction, a line toward the horizon. Two bearings from different ships give a point on the map. The calculation takes minutes, sometimes less time than the message itself, which the boat's radio operator has just finished sending. Not one paragraph of the German instructions on radio discipline considers this scenario. The instructions ask whether the message can be read. They never ask whether the transmitter itself can simply be found. The gap between those two questions is about to get a name and a body count. The 2nd of June, 1943. The boat from the opening, the one that went on the air convinced of its own silence, is called U-202. Her commanding officer is Kapitanleutnant Gunther Poser, an experienced officer for whom this patrol is neither his first nor his 10th. Starling finds him not by breaking the message, but by taking a bearing on the signal itself, closing to attack range before the boat's lookouts even spot the ship on the horizon. The first pattern of depth charges lands in a tight fan and does not sink the boat outright, only tears the outer hull and knocks out instruments inside the pressure hull. Poser is forced to surface and fight it out on top, gun against gun, because the boat is already unmanageable underwater. A few minutes of gunnery decided. Shells wreck the conning tower, the boat lists over, and starts taking on water through holes at the waterline. Poser understands the fight is lost, and understands it before he can get out a single word to his crew. He grabs the scorching barrel of the periscope, shouts for the crew to abandon ship, and in the next second shoots himself in the temple. He does not surrender. He never learns that what betrayed him was not the cipher, but the very habit of going on the air, the habit his own command in Lorient considered perfectly safe. Part of the crew managed to get over the side and end up in the cold water beside the wreck of a boat that should never have existed at all, if the staff's assumption about the safety of radio communication had held even halfway. They are pulled out of the water by British sailors, the same men who had been firing on them minutes before. The prisoners are brought into port and questioned by standard procedure, and not one of them can give the intelligence officer a clear explanation of how they were found so fast in an empty square of ocean where there had not been a single aircraft or ship in sight beforehand. To them, it stays unexplained through the whole interrogation. The loss of U-202 lands in Dönitz's weekly summary as one line among a dozen other losses that month, without any particular investigation, because the cause looks obvious. Bad luck. The ordinary risk of a patrol. Nobody yet connects this one specific case to a growing list of similar reports from the previous weeks. One sunk boat proves nothing. What happens next does. 1943 is the year historians of the Battle of the Atlantic will later call the turning point. The turn shows up not in one battle but on the curve of losses stretched out over several months at once. In the spring of that year, Germany's submarine fleet is still sinking ships by the dozens each month and still believes in its own superiority. By summer, the curve reverses, and from that point, it never returns to its earlier numbers for the rest of the war, no matter how many new hulls the yards at Hamburg and Kiel launch. The story of U-202 and Kapitanleutnant Poser is neither the start of that turn nor its end. It is one episode inside a wider pattern that Dönitz's staff sees as separate accidents rather than a system working against them methodically, patrol after patrol. That same summer, Walker's group keeps adding to its own tally, boat after boat, and every fresh kill lands in the same reports as the complaints coming in from returning commanders since April. An attack follows a transmission too fast, as if the enemy already knew the coordinates. By the autumn of '43, Dönitz's staff can no longer write the whole pattern off as coincidence. The count is too large and too regular for that. But the explanation is still sought in the wrong place. They suspect espionage at the shipyards. They suspect a traitor among the signals officers and check every one of them and find nobody. They change the codes, add new cipher tables, tighten radio discipline aboard, demand shorter messages. None of these measures solves the actual problem. What is written in the message never mattered at all. What matters is only the plain fact that it was sent into the open air. The code can be changed forever. An antenna hears a signal no matter what cipher covers it. Among the signals officers in Lorient, one theory circulates that comes closer to the truth than any other, and it is never taken seriously. A handful of engineers point to the transmission frequency itself as a possible source of the leak, regardless of what it contains. The idea gets dismissed because it contradicts the basic principle of the entire submarine warfare doctrine. Without frequent communication, the pack stops being a pack and turns into dozens of lone hunters, and command is not prepared to accept that under any circumstances. It is easier to believe in a spy than to admit that the structure of the tactic itself has become its own weak point. Aboard boats not yet touched by the new method, crews sense something is wrong long before any official explanation arrives. Rumors spread that the British can somehow see a boat through the depth of the water. Some blame the moon, some blame their own carelessness, some simply stop reporting unless absolutely necessary and get reprimanded by command for breaking procedure. The war machine demands discipline, even when that very discipline is what kills. The method that found and killed Poser in June turns into routine over the following months. Walker drills the coordination between his ships to the point of automatism. A maneuver that in the first weeks required long exchanges over the intercom now takes seconds by winter, because every sloop captain knows his part by heart before the order is even given. At the same time, Huff-Duff coverage keeps growing, station by station, ship by ship, until the network closes over most of the routes German boats normally take toward their hunting grounds. Germany launches a new submarine almost every week. The yards at Hamburg and Kiel run 3 shifts, and the number of hulls in service keeps rising all year, losses notwithstanding. Materiel for the war is not something Germany lacks. Walker's group will sink 3 boats in 15 hours in a single patrol. At the pier in Lorient, the next hull in line, painted, fueled, ready for launch, fills the empty berth immediately. But the names of the crew that was supposed to sail her out will never be entered there again. A shipyard can replace a hull in a week. A crew that has spent 2 years at sea and knows their boat by feel in the dark cannot be replaced nearly as fast. And Dönitz understands that difference better than anyone on his staff. The 29th of January, 1944. Walker's 6 sloops, Starling, Wild Goose, Wren, Woodpecker, Cygnet, and Kite, put to sea on the patrol that will later be called the most effective of the entire campaign. The weather at the start is unusually calm for the winter Atlantic, and that calm is deceptive. Walker uses it to keep the group in tight formation and react to any bearing without delay. On the 31st of January, the patrol lands its first blow. Huff-Duff gives a bearing, 2 ships move into position, and the patrol's first creeping attack unfolds. One holds contact and directs, the other moves in blind and drops on the signal. U-592 goes down without ever understanding she had been found, before the sonar even made contact, found by the plain fact of her own report to headquarters. After that, Starling's crew barely needs to discuss the order of the maneuver among themselves. It all runs on drilled reflex. The 9th of February brings what will later be called the peak of the patrol. Huff-Duff picks up 2 separate signals within the same day, and the group splits to cover both targets. The first attack of the day runs the way nearly every attack of the group runs by now. Wild Goose holds contact by sonar from a safe distance, calling out the target's course and depth every few seconds in a level voice. No panic, no rush. Starling, meanwhile, moves in slowly, at bare steerage way, sonar switched off so as not to give herself away with a single ping. On the bridge, nobody speaks above a whisper, as if sound itself could carry through the hull and reach the boat below. When the range closes to the calculated point, Wild Goose sends a short signal, and off Starling's stern the charges go into the water one after another, set to different depths. A few seconds of silence pass. Then the water swells in white mounds, and an air bubble breaks the surface, followed by an oil slick. Then wreckage. U-734 answers no further signal. The second attack of the day is not long in coming. Before dark, Huff-Duff gives a fresh bearing, and the same pattern repeats with another pair of the group's ships, the same rhythm, the same calculation. U-238 goes down within a few hours of the first boat. Inside the same single day, the group records 2 kills at once, both found the same way, both finished within hours of each other. The crews barely sleep between attacks, running on coffee and adrenaline, because every fresh target means the method worked again exactly as it was designed to, months earlier, in the mind of one stubborn captain. On the 19th of February, a 4th boat of the patrol goes down, U-264. 6 kills in one patrol, 3 of them inside 15 hours. No other group in the entire Battle of the Atlantic will match that tally in a single outing. The Admiralty marks the patrol with its own dispatch, and Walker receives another bar to his decoration, not as first of the war and not as last. Victory does not come free, even for the victors. The day after the last sinking, a German torpedo from another boat, U-256, strikes Woodpecker's stern, one of the group's 6 sloops, the very one that had held contact in the attack on the 9th of February. The blast tears away part of the after hull plating. The ship loses power, but stays afloat. The crew is taken off almost to the last man before the tow even begins, because even without power, the ship is too valuable to abandon outright. Another sloop of the group takes the damaged hull under tow and starts the slow passage toward the nearest port across the open Atlantic. 7 days of towing pass in a running fight with the weather. The line goes slack and pulls taut again and again. Woodpecker's stern settles lower under water that cannot be pumped out fast enough. On the 27th of February, in the middle of a fresh storm, the tow line finally gives way and parts. The empty hull, with not one man aboard, because all of them had been taken off in time, rolls broadside to the swell and slowly goes under. The group that had just written the most effective patrol of the naval war into the record loses one of its own ships less than a week after the triumph. The method Walker built works against submarines without fail. Against a torpedo in dark water, it protects no one, not even its own. Dönitz's staff logs the patrol's losses and searches for an explanation once again. A chance crossing of routes, a run of bad luck for a whole week straight. A leak inside the staff itself that will never be found, no matter how many officers get checked, because the search is aimed at the wrong place entirely. The real answer is simpler and far more humiliating than any of those. Word of the patrol reaches Britain itself, where, for months, the only news arriving has been losses among the merchant fleet. The papers call Walker and his sloops hunters, not convoy watchdogs. And for the first time in a long while, the stories about the war at sea sound not like a chronicle of tragedy, but like an account of a victory you can hold in your hand. This many boats, this many hours. 6 small gray hulls against an entire fleet. For a country where ration books sit on every kitchen table, and one crossing in 3 risks never arriving, that shift in tone means more than a dry Admiralty communique. Walker himself barely rests after the patrol. While the press writes up the triumph, he is already preparing the group for its next sortie, ordering fresh drills in the creeping attack with the 5 ships he has left, personally checking every sonar report. The people around him notice that victory brings him no relief, only a fresh list of what could be improved next time. That same punishing rhythm, the one that will bring the group 23 confirmed kills across 2 years of service, more than any other formation in the fleet, is building up inside Walker himself as a fatigue nobody can yet see from the outside. By the start of 1944, direction-finding posts stand not only on shore. Almost every escort ship in the Atlantic carries one, standard issue, as ordinary as a compass or a lifebelt. An everyday piece of equipment on any ship, no longer a rarity, no longer an experiment confined to one solitary vessel. The set fills a corner of the wheelhouse no bigger than a wardrobe. The antenna turns by hand on a crank, and the entire calculation fits on a slip of paper, worked out with a pair of dividers. An operator running one of these stations does not need to speak German and does not need to read a single line of the intercepted message. All that is needed is the fact of the transmission itself and a loop antenna turned toward the loudest sound in the headphones. Not one of the group's 6 ships carries this equipment, as a rarity or a reward for special merit. It sits aboard every one of them simply because by this stage of the war, the Admiralty has refitted nearly the entire Atlantic escort fleet with it, from the smallest sloop to the largest destroyer, folded it into the standard list of gear alongside sonar and life rafts. What in 1941 had been a rare experimental novelty aboard one trial ship has, by the winter of 1944, become an ordinary, forgettable fitting. That very ordinariness is what makes the system lethal. The enemy has nothing to fight, because there is no single target he can destroy with one blow. To destroy it, he would have to destroy the habit of going on the air itself. And the whole pack tactic depended on that habit. In his last minutes on the surface, the commanding officer of U-264 understands one thing. This is not one ship's luck. Around him is a network that has been listening to him since the exact second he first keyed his microphone at the start of the patrol. He had followed his staff's orders to the letter, reported the weather, reported the coordinates, reported the contact, exactly as the instructions demanded from the first line to the last. The instructions never warned him that this very precision would be what killed him. Stop here for a second, because from this point on, every detail in this story matters. This was not coincidence. This was a system. Before reaching the moment when Walker himself pays for that system with everything he has, it is worth staying with him a little longer at his greatest victory, because that victory is exactly what will make the next part of this story harder to watch. Stay to the end to see what February 1944 costs him in the months that follow. Spring of 1944 passes for Walker's group in the same rhythm as the winter before it. Sortie, search, attack. A short call at port to refuel, back out again. The fame of the February patrol brings the group not rest, but more attention from headquarters and more assignments. Where 6 sloops once covered a single sector, they are now moved to wherever Huff-Duff shows the heaviest density of signals, which means near constant time at sea, with only short breaks for fuel and minimal repair. Young officers joining the group after the February triumph do not find Walker the cheerful, energetic hunter from the newspaper photographs, but a man who speaks in short sentences and rarely smiles off the bridge. On the 5th of May, Starling, together with Wild Goose and Wren, sinks U-473, using the same creeping attack, by now so automatic that the ships no longer need to discuss it between themselves. It is the last boat Walker will ever add to his personal tally. He does not know that yet. Nobody among the crews understands why they are being kept at constant readiness off the south coast for the next couple of weeks. Orders arrive in fragments with no explanation of the larger picture, only the demand to hold position and miss no bearing in this particular sector. The answer comes on the 6th of June, when the horizon off the Normandy coast fills with thousands of ships of the Allied fleet, the largest seaborne invasion in the history of warfare. Western Approaches Command splits the sectors of the channel among several groups, but it is Walker's sloops, as the most drilled and effective team in the whole fleet, who are given the most nerve-wracking part of the job, keeping the entrance to the channel sealed against German boats while the landings go ahead. Letting even a single boat through to the crowded troop transports would have meant a disaster people would still be writing about decades later. The sloops patrol the channel around the clock, with no relief, because there are simply no spare crews for that kind of load. The radio operators listen to the airwaves without a break, watch after watch, and every fresh bearing, even a false one, brings the whole bridge to its feet. Through the first critical 2 weeks after the landings, not one German boat gets through the sector the group holds. Along the whole invasion coast, the Allies will destroy 15 boats trying to break through to the landing fleet. But Starling herself will not add a single fresh kill to her tally this time. The group's success here is measured not in the number of sinkings, but in what never happens. Not one troop transport hit, not one boat slipping through unnoticed. For a crew used to counting the war in sunken boats, this kind of victory feels unfamiliar, and no less exhausting for it. Men at the guns and in the engine room stand watch for days on end so that nothing will happen, and that rarely brings the same relief to the nerves as a real explosion underwater and an oil slick breaking the surface. On one of those nights, Huff-Duff gives a sharp, strong bearing directly across the convoy's course, and the group swings around at full speed, braced to repeat the February pattern all over again, right here at the very throat of the invasion. The depth charge crews take their stations, the signalmen hold the searchlights ready, and Walker himself, as always, does not leave the bridge until a second ship confirms contact. After several long minutes of tension that feel far longer on the bridge than any clock could show, it turns out the source of the signal is not a German boat at all, but a friendly reconnaissance aircraft that had wandered onto the same frequency by chance. The alert is called off, the ships return to course, and not one man on the crew says the relief out loud, because there are still many hours left on the watch, and the next bearing might be real. False alarms like this happen dozens of times over the 2 weeks of patrolling the channel, and each one cost the crew just as much as a genuine attack would. Few of the 1,000 people who would later watch a gun carriage pass through the streets of Liverpool that summer knew one detail of his own family's story. Walker's son, Sub-Lieutenant John Timothy Ryder Walker, had served aboard a submarine and had gone down with her in the Mediterranean before his father ever reached his loudest victory in February of '44. The man who spent 2 years hunting other men's submarines more methodically than any other officer in the Allied fleet was himself the father of a submariner who had died inside the same kind of steel tube underwater. He never publicly connected the two. His fellow officers only remembered that after that loss, he began spending even more time on the bridge than before, as if one more watch could fix something that could no longer be fixed at all. On the 13th of June, a week after the landings, Walker is given a third bar to his Distinguished Service Order, an award that is by now far from his first of this war. The ceremony is held right there in port, brief, without any great fuss, because the group has to be back at sea at the first opportunity. Walker accepts the decoration in the same worn uniform he had stood watch in the day before, and within a few hours he is back out in the channel with his ships. By this point he has not had a full night's sleep in many days running, eats in snatches between watches on the bridge, and the officers around him notice his hands have started to shake noticeably over his morning tea. Nobody dares suggest he stay ashore and rest, because in 2 years of service he has never once agreed to that voluntarily, and asking him now, in the middle of an operation of this scale, feels unthinkable. A month after the landings, once the threat to the channel finally eases and part of the group is pulled back for a short rest, Walker comes ashore in Liverpool for the first time in a long while after another patrol. He does not complain of his health and does not ask for rest, simply goes home, the way he has done dozens of times before across 2 years of war. On the 7th of July, he suffers a stroke. Doctors at the Naval Hospital in Seaforth state the cause plainly: exhaustion and overstrain from years of continuous service at sea, without a single extended break since the very start of the war. His wife, Jessica Eileen Walker, comes to the hospital and stays at his side for the 2 full days he spends unconscious. She had already once received news of loss in this family, when word came of their son's death aboard a submarine. And now she sits at the bedside of a husband who had made that very same undersea war his personal purpose for 2 years running. On the 9th of July, 1944, Captain Frederick Walker dies at the age of 48, without ever regaining consciousness. Sit with that. 48 years old, no battle that day, not a single enemy torpedo. The Admiralty issues an official statement, short and direct. Captain Walker's death is recorded as aggravated by, and attributable to, the conditions of his naval service. The wording reads dry, bureaucratic, closer to a line from a financial report than a description of what actually happened to a man who had not left the bridge for longer than a few days at a stretch across 2 full years. But behind that dryness sits an admission rare for military bureaucracy. The department states outright that the war is the cause of death for an officer who died from the sheer length of his own service, without a single bullet and without a single splinter. This is not the usual, polite, rounded language of a death notice. This is an official acknowledgement that the war killed him, just as surely as a torpedo would have, only slower, without a single shot fired by the enemy, and without a single witness on the enemy's side who could be called guilty. On the 11th of July, Captain Walker's body is carried out of Liverpool Cathedral with full military honors. About 1,000 people attend the funeral, sailors from his own group, representatives of every service, dock workers who had never served under his command but knew his name from every wartime dispatch of the last 2 years, as well as they knew the names of their own neighbors. The streets along the procession route are lined with people standing in silence, without the shouts and cheers usually reserved for living heroes, because they are burying a man. The victory he won, the city had already celebrated in the dispatches of past months. Today the city says goodbye to its cost. Many of those standing along the curb had themselves lost relatives on the very convoy routes he had spent 2 years defending, and understand this loss better than any official words could express. The gun carriage bearing the coffin, draped in the British flag, moves slowly through the streets of Liverpool to the pierhead, to the point where the city looks straight out toward the mouth of the river and the open sea beyond it. The sea he had sailed out into on every single patrol. From there, the coffin is taken aboard the destroyer Hesperus, and the captain is buried at sea, in Liverpool Bay, in the very waters from which he had always come back with a victory. Now he will not come back at all. The group he built will keep serving under new command to the end of the war, but it will never again match the tally it set in February under him. The antenna that found Poser a year earlier in the Atlantic keeps listening to the airwaves after Walker's funeral, too. Because the war is not over, and boats are still putting to sea with the very same instructions from the very same headquarters. Grand Admiral Dönitz will survive the war, stand trial, serve his sentence, and write memoirs in which he explains at length why his fleet's ciphers had remained secure. In that narrow sense, he will turn out to be right almost to the last day of the war. The code really is never broken. He will be wrong about a far simpler question, one that stays without a clear answer in his own memoirs, because the technology of direction finding will remain a state secret on both sides of the Atlantic for decades after the war, filed under the very same classification as the breaking of codes. Historians will only put the full picture together decades later, as military archives slowly open to researchers, document by document. Until then, even some British historians will credit Walker's success mainly to his personal talent as a hunter, without mentioning the network of stations listening across the ocean from shore to shore. The talent was real, but without hundreds of operators on shore and on deck, turning loop antennas in the dark for hours at a stretch, that talent alone would not have sunk a tenth of what is credited to the group. Even the German submariners who survived the war and lived long enough to see part of the archives declassified admitted in interviews that to the last days of their service they had explained their losses as anything but the simplest cause. Some blamed traitors, some blamed a new generation of radar, some considered it simply a run of bad luck too long to be chance, but not clear enough to point to any one source. Kapitanleutnant Hartwig Lux, commanding officer of U-264, the only one of this story's antagonists who will live to see captivity rather than the ocean floor, gives a single interview years later about that day in February of '44. No further confirmation of that conversation exists, and that is worth saying plainly before repeating his words. The panic aboard, the order to scuttle, the freezing water rising through the compartments faster than the crew could seal the bulkheads. The entire crew, all 52 men, are pulled from the water alive. He will say that until the last minute, nobody aboard understood that what had betrayed them was not a spy and not chance, but the ordinary habit, required by regulation, of going on the air on schedule. Kapitanleutnant Poser's story ends the same way, only with a different final act, 8 months earlier. One commander chooses a revolver, the other chooses captivity, but neither of them chose the system that brought them both to that choice. Both were following the exact same order from headquarters, word for word, 8 months apart, and both were brought to their end by the very same gap between one question, whether a message could be read, and another, whether the man who sent it could be found. Poser and Lux never met, and probably never even knew of each other, but their boats are linked more closely than any other pair of ships in this story. Both sailed from the same port, both received the same radio instructions, both were found the same way, by ships of the same group, less than a year apart. Between those two episodes, Walker's group carries out dozens of other attacks, most of which never make the papers, never make a memoir, never earn a separate line in an official record, and simply become one more figure in the running total of a patrol. History remembers the names only of the few whose death or capture proved dramatic enough for a witness to record. The rest of the boats and the rest of the crews exist in the story only as part of that same sum of 23 victories, without faces and without last words. The convoys that Walker's group, and dozens of formations like it, brought across the Atlantic in 1943 and '44, carried to Britain not some abstract cargo, but fuel and munitions for the invasion fleet that would land in Normandy that same June. The very month Walker himself stood on the bridge of his own sloop off that same coast. The line between the radio operator from the opening of this story and the soldier stepping off a landing craft a year later is straight and short, even though at first glance the two seem to share nothing but the same stretch of cold ocean. The outcome of this story is simple if you only count the numbers. Walker's group will sink 23 submarines across 2 years of continuous service, more than any other Allied formation in the entire Battle of the Atlantic. Not one of those kills came from breaking a German code. Every one of them came from a bearing taken on the plain fact of a transmission, the exact vulnerability German doctrine considered irrelevant, because the instructions only ever asked one of two possible questions, and the second question cost the fleet far more than the first. For comparison, most individual escort ships of the war needed only one confirmed kill in their entire service to count as effective, and some spent years on patrol without meeting a single target. 6 sloops in one group, working the same method, ran up a score that would otherwise have been spread across dozens of different ships over dozens of different patrols. The difference is not luck, and it is not the quality of the crews, who were not fundamentally different from those in any neighboring group. The difference lies in the method itself, available to anyone willing to use it, but truly put into practice by only one stubborn captain who was allowed to break with the usual order of convoy escort. And in a network of antennas that made the method possible long before any ship ever reached its attack position. After the war, both the creeping attack and the very idea of pairing direction finding with deliberate hunting instead of passive escort are folded into the training programs for anti-submarine officers as standard course material, with no reference to the secrecy that had covered these methods during the war itself. Cadets who never heard Walker's name spend years working through the diagram of his maneuver on training boards, never knowing that the diagram was born out of one captain's plain technical irritation at the blind spot in his own sonar. To them, it is simply one of the standard tactics in the textbook, as nameless as the hundreds of operators whose bearings once made that tactic lethal. Today, on the Liverpool waterfront, facing the mouth of the River Mersey, stands a bronze figure of a man in a worn sweater over his uniform jacket, the kind he wore on the bridge for months at a stretch. The sculptor Tom Murphy finished the work in 1998, and the statue was unveiled by the Duke of Edinburgh more than half a century after the captain last climbed aboard his own ship, in front of veterans of his own group who had lived to see the day. The statue looks out exactly where he himself looked every time before putting to sea. The city at his back, only water ahead, water where a boat can still be found by nothing more than the plain fact of a stranger's voice on the air. The radio operator the story opened with, that nameless man at the transmitter key somewhere in the Atlantic, remains without a name and without a date of his own death, because he is one of thousands who sent the same reports the same way for the whole war. That very anonymity is where the true scale of the miscalculation lies. It was never about one commander or one boat, but about the entire communications system of a fleet, built on the assumption that silence could be bought with one good cipher. Just as nameless in this story are the operators of the direction-finding stations on the other side, hundreds of men and women who sat in headphones for days on end on shore and on deck, turning loop antennas in the dark, without a single line in a citation next to Walker's name. No monument in Liverpool shows their faces or names them. It was them, not one captain and not one statue on a waterfront, who turned the open ocean from a hiding place into a trap. Watch after watch, bearing after bearing, for the rest of the war. Not one German staff officer, reviewing the reasons for defeat in the Atlantic after the war, will name radio discipline as the main mistake. Official post-war reviews reach more often for other words: underestimated radar, fuel shortages, obsolete torpedoes. All of that is true as well, but none of those factors explains why this particular boat, on this particular night, was found in an empty square of ocean before she could even dive after her report. The simple answer rarely makes it into official post-war reviews, because admitting it means admitting something plain and deeply unpleasant. The war was methodically killing them through their own obedience, demanded by regulation, every day, on every patrol. If someone in your family served in the Atlantic escort groups, aboard a submarine, or in the merchant marine of that period, leave their name and their ship in the comments. That is how these names keep living past the files in the archives. And if you want to see how an ordinary habit of going on the air became the cause of an entire fleet's destruction, subscribe. There is more than one story like this one still to come. He went on his last patrol not under enemy fire, and not to an enemy torpedo. He went out of service the same way the boat's own antenna hunted went out of service. Not all at once, but inevitably, report after report, watch after watch, until the silence came for him too. The only difference is that nobody was trying to take a bearing on his silence. It simply arrived, quietly, without a single report, and stayed for good.